This is the sixth in a series of resources that look at broad topics in macroeconomics. Part 1 considers the gross domestic product, defining it in each component part, working through a couple of examples, and considering the limitations of the GDP as a measure of welfare. Part 2 considers the difference between public and private goods, and looks at certain issues arising from public goods. Part 3 inspects the difference between real and nominal measures, working through an example. Part 4 looks at unemployment, providing definitions for various types of unemployment, and also defining other factors involved in calculating unemployment rates. Part 5 considers the Consumer Price Index, defining it, working through examples, and explaining how the CPI applies to actual real-world problems. Part 6 looks at economic growth, suggesting general methods countries may use to expand their economy. In a previous resource, we discussed how economists use the gross domestic product to measure the standard of living in a nation. More specifically, the GDP per capita. Therefore, the only way the standard of living can improve is for the GDP to increase. How can this happen? There are two ways in which the GDP per capita increase: capital deepening and technological progress. Capital deepening is the process of firms obtaining more capital. A firm's capital are their plants, property, and equipment. To be more specific, capital deepening indicates that firms have increases in buildings and equipment per worker. Any income not spent by a company is considered savings. To the thinking of an economist, those savings will eventually be invested into the company's stock of capital. Therefore, increases in savings also is considered part of capital deepening. How does capital deepening increase the gross domestic product? The basic idea is that each worker has more capital with which to work. Those workers should then be more productive. This will lead to more productivity overall for the entire nation. The other way nations increase their gross domestic product per capita is through technological progress. With technological progress, the economy works more efficiently because it learns how to do more work with less input. Where does this technological progress come from? One possibility is through research and development. Companies, or the nation as a whole, may provide funding for new technologies. Similarly, monopolies spur technological progress. Companies are more willing to take risks if they can profit off them. Monopolies allow companies to try new concepts and technologies, since they are guaranteed to reap any rewards the new tech provide. Another possible cause of technological progress is the scale of a market. More companies competing in a market means more companies trying to determine the best methods for production. This leads directly to technological progress. Similarly, companies try to find some competitive advantage. One way to do so is to be able to produce at a lower cost. This means trying new technologies to find some way to cut costs, which in turn indicates companies trying new innovations, leading to technological progress. The final cause of technological progress is simply that humans learn. We try things out and say, hey, that worked better than what we did before. We determine best practices and then pass that knowledge on to others. We even train others on our newfound discoveries. The study of increases in GDP is called growth accounting. It is a method to determine the contribution to economic growth from capital deepening, which is increased labor and capital, or from technological progress. Growth accounting determines if the increase in GDP comes from working harder with capital deepening or working smarter with technological progress. However, it is possible for economies to grow in other ways. Economic growth happens when production increases without increasing the assets required. This shifts the production possibility curve outward. When considering this growth rate, it is often useful to consider the effects of having the same rate of growth per year. This becomes an exponential growth. Knowing this growth rate allows a good approximation of how long it will take for the nation to double its output. This rule of 70 states that the time it takes for a country to double its output is approximately 70 divided by the growth rate. Economists like to compare things. One would think economists would want to compare the growth rates for different nations, but this process is difficult. Comparing nations is difficult for two main reasons. First, different nations have different currencies. The exchange rates between currencies are constantly changing. Also, customers in different nations have different purchasing preferences. The ideal would be a world in which all nations have equal wealth and economic health. As we saw in previous resources, this health is measured by the gross domestic product, more specifically, the real GDP per capita. Convergence is the process by which poorer countries close the gap with richer countries in terms of real GDP per capita. So far, most of the macroeconomics resources have focused on a very broad topics and measures of economic health of a nation. But what are the roles of the government in a market economy? First, they enforce the rules of the economy. They also ensure that contracts are upheld. Finally, governments ensure that property rights are enforced. Okay, the first two make sense. But what is this about property rights? Who actually owns the tract of land? Without clear property rights, companies have no incentive to invest in the property. Why would a company put money into improving a property if they do not own the land, and therefore cannot benefit from the improvement? Property rights are sometimes lacking in third world and other poor nations. This lack is part of the reason convergence is so difficult to achieve.